The fuel depot sat 3 miles inland from Omaha Beach, hidden beneath camouflage nets that sagged with November rain. Sergeant Bill Hooper stood beside a stack of jerry cans, his M1 carbine slung loose across his chest, watching a lieutenant colonel he'd never seen before walk the perimeter with hard eyes and a clipboard that looked too clean for Normandy mud. The colonel stopped, pointed at Hooper. "You, Private." "Sergeant, sir." The colonel's jaw tightened. "You've been here how long?" "8 weeks, sir. 8 weeks guarding gasoline." The colonel's voice carried contempt. While real soldiers pushed toward Germany, Hooper said nothing. Rain dripped from his helmet brim onto a fuel manifest clipped to a wooden crate. Numbers circled in red pencil, dates that didn't match, convoy routes that bent east when they should have gone north. The colonel stepped closer. "You know what happens to cowards who hide in supply depots?" Hooper's hand rested on the manifest. His eyes stayed level. "No, sir, but I know what happens when fuel doesn't reach Patton's tanks. Now, what I'm going to tell you today, it might just change how you think about the fuel that kept our boys moving toward Berlin. See, this isn't just another war story. It's about the kind of quiet battles that happened behind the lines, the ones that never made the papers. If you want to make sure stories like this don't get lost, the real ones veterans used to tell over coffee at the VFW hall, hit that subscribe button right now. We're keeping these memories alive, one story at a time, and believe me, this one's worth remembering." The colonel didn't answer right away. He looked at Hooper the way officers look at men they've already dismissed, a glance that measured uniform condition, posture, the mud on boots, the way a carbine hung. Hooper had seen that look before. Most men wilted under it. Most men started explaining themselves. Hooper just stood there, rain tapping his helmet, breath visible in the cold November air. Behind him, 3 privates unloaded fuel drums from a deuce and a half, their movements slow and careful. Gasoline was more valuable than gold this close to the front. The colonel turned toward the command tent without another word. Hooper watched him go, then bent and picked up the manifest again. The numbers didn't lie. 7 convoys in 3 weeks. 4 had been late. 2 had been short by 30%. 1 never arrived at all. The official report said mechanical failure outside St. Lo. But Hooper had walked that route twice. There were no burn marks on the road, no wreckage, just empty kilometers and a story that didn't fit. Inside the tent, Captain Ed Ferris sat at a folding table covered in maps and requisition forms. He was 42, older than most infantry officers with a face weathered by 2 decades in the Quartermaster Corps. He glanced up when Hooper entered, rain dripping from the sergeant's poncho onto the dirt floor. Ferris didn't ask what the colonel wanted. He already knew. Word traveled fast in a depot, faster than fuel sometimes. He slid a tin cup of coffee across the table. It was cold. Hooper drank it anyway. "He's from 3rd Army Logistics," Ferris said quietly. "Came in this morning asking questions about our delivery times." "Which ones?" "All of them." Ferris tapped a pencil against a convoy schedule pinned to a corkboard. "Said Patton's armor is stalling 20 miles short of the German border because fuel isn't arriving on time. He wants to know why." Hooper set the cup down. "Did you tell him?" "I told him what I could prove." Ferris leaned back in his chair. "Weather delays, road conditions, enemy air activity. Standard problems for November in France." He paused. "I didn't tell him what I suspect." Hooper pulled a folded map from his jacket and spread it on the table. It was hand-marked, routes traced in pencil, dates and tonnage written in the margins. Ferris had seen it before. So had Hooper. They'd spent 3 nights going over it after the convoy from Cherbourg vanished. The routes didn't follow standard military corridors. They bent east toward Metz, then looped south, adding 15 miles to trips that should have been direct. Someone was rerouting fuel, not stealing it, redirecting it, and doing it with enough authority that no one questioned the orders until the tanks ran dry. The tent flap opened. A corporal stepped inside, helmet crooked, holding a message slip. "Sir, radio from forward command. Lieutenant Greer's convoy is 2 hours overdue." Ferris didn't move. "Which route?" "Route Bravo, sir." "Through Valognes." Hooper looked at the map. Route Bravo was clean, open road. No reported enemy contact in 4 days. It should have been the safest run they had. Ferris met his eyes across the table. and something silent passed between them, the kind of understanding that comes from watching patterns repeat until they stop looking like accidents. The corporal stood waiting, rain dripping from his poncho, young enough that he didn't yet know when to leave officers alone. "Get a jeep ready," Hooper said. "I'm going to find them." Ferris started to argue, then stopped. He knew better. Hooper had been running convoys since North Africa. If anyone could track a missing fuel truck through 50 miles of rain-soaked Norman countryside, it was him. Ferris signed a movement order and handed it over. "Take Morrison and Katz. If you find trouble, don't engage. Report back." "Yes, sir." "And Hooper," Ferris hesitated. "That colonel, he's not just asking questions. He's building a case. Someone's going to take the fall for this fuel shortage, and he's deciding who." Hooper folded the movement order into his jacket. Outside, the rain had thickened into a steady drumming against canvas and metal. Morrison and Katz were already loading gear into the jeep. Extra ammunition, blankets, a field radio that crackled with static. Morrison was a farm kid from Iowa, good with engines. Katz was from Brooklyn, sharp-eyed and cautious. Neither one asked why they were heading out into weather like this. In a war, you learned not to ask. You just went. They rolled out at 1400 hours, the jeep's tires churning mud as they left the depot behind. The road toward Valognes was narrow, lined with hedgerows that dripped water like broken gutters. Hooper drove in silence, eyes scanning the roadside for tire tracks, fuel stains, anything that might indicate where Greer's convoy had stopped. Morrison sat in back, M1 rifle braced against his knee. Katz worked the radio, trying to raise forward units. All he got was static and fragments of distant chatter, artillery coordinates, medical evacuations, the constant hum of a war-grinding east. 5 miles out, Hooper slowed the jeep. Ahead, the road curved around a bombed-out farmhouse. Its roof collapsed into blackened beams. Tire tracks veered off into the field beside it. Deep ruts cut into mud. Fresh tracks. Hooper killed the engine. The silence that followed felt too large, too empty. Morrison chambered around without being told. Katz lowered the radio volume. They sat there, breath fogging in the cold, listening. No artillery, no aircraft, just wind through broken walls and the distant caw of crows. "Stay with the jeep," Hooper said. He climbed out, carbine up, and moved toward the tracks. They led 20 yards into the field, then stopped at a cluster of trees. No fuel truck, no bodies. Just a canvas tarp half buried in mud covering something angular and heavy. Hooper pulled it back. Underneath were jerry cans, 50 of them, maybe more, stacked in rows and marked with Third Army supply codes. Full, untouched, hidden. He stood there for a long moment, rain soaking through his jacket, staring at fuel that should have been 50 miles east, keeping tanks running toward the Rhine. Someone had diverted this convoy, ordered it off the main road, told the driver to offload here and leave it, and that someone had enough authority to make a lieutenant obey without question. Hooper covered the cans again, memorizing the location, then walked back to the jeep. Morrison and Katz looked at him, waiting. "We keep moving," Hooper said. "Greer's still out there somewhere." They found the convoy 6 miles further north, parked in a clearing beside a stone chapel that had survived the war better than the village around it. 3 trucks sat idling, their tarps lashed tight over fuel drums. Lieutenant Greer stood beside the lead truck, smoking a cigarette, talking to a man in a clean uniform. Not muddy, not worn, the kind of uniform you saw on officers who spent more time behind desks than in jeeps. The man turned when Hooper's jeep pulled in. His insignia marked him as a major, Quartermaster Corps. His face had the smooth, untroubled look of someone who'd never had to explain a missing convoy. Hooper stepped out. "Lieutenant Greer, you're 2 hours overdue." Greer dropped his cigarette into the mud. "Had to make a detour, Sergeant. Orders." "From who?" The major answered before Greer could. "From me. Major Karl Voss, 3rd Army Logistics." His voice carried the easy confidence of rank. "And you are?" "Sergeant William Hooper, Fuel Depot Command." Voss smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Well, Sergeant, you can head back and tell Captain Ferris that his convoy is fine. We're just verifying loads before final delivery." He gestured toward the trucks. "Supply chain integrity. I'm sure you understand." Hooper looked at Greer. The lieutenant wouldn't meet his eyes. Morrison and Katz stayed in the jeep, hands near their rifles, watching. The rain kept falling. Somewhere in the distance, artillery thumped, a low, rolling sound that made the ground shiver. Hooper's hand rested on his carbine sling, and he thought about 50 jerry cans hidden in a muddy field, and convoys that never arrived, and numbers that didn't match, and a war that was stalling because someone, somewhere, was playing a game with fuel that soldiers needed to stay alive. "I'll need to see your authorization, sir," Hooper said. Major Voss stopped smiling. "Excuse me? Your written authorization for convoy detours. Captain Ferris requires it for all route changes." Hooper kept his voice level, respectful. "Standard procedure, sir." The clearing went quiet. Greer shifted his weight, nervous. Voss stared at Hooper like he was seeing him for the first time, really seeing him, and calculating whether this muddy sergeant with a carbine was someone who could be dismissed or someone who'd just become a problem. The rain drummed against steel helmets and canvas tarps. Katz's hand moved closer to his rifle, and Hooper stood there, waiting, knowing that whatever happened next would decide whether fuel reached the front or stayed buried in French fields while Patton's tanks ran dry 50 miles from Germany. Voss's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a hardness that hadn't been there before. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document, holding it between two fingers like it was evidence in a trial. "My authorization, Sergeant. Designed by Colonel Marsh, 3rd Army Supply. Satisfied?" His voice carried an edge now, the false courtesy stripped away. Hooper took the paper and read it carefully. The signature looked legitimate. The language was proper military bureaucracy. But the date was wrong. 3 days old, written before this convoy had even left the depot. "This authorizes route changes for future convoys," Hooper said. "Not this one. Are you calling me a liar, Sergeant?" "I'm saying the dates don't match, sir." Hooper handed the paper back. "Lieutenant Greer left the depot this morning. This authorization is from Monday." He looked at Greer. "Did you receive verbal orders, Lieutenant?" Greer's face went pale. He glanced at Voss, then at Hooper, caught between two men who both outranked his instinct to survive. The rain kept falling. One of the truck engines coughed and died. In the sudden quiet, Hooper could hear his own breathing, steady and controlled. Voss folded the document and put it away. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost reasonable. "You seem like a smart man, Hooper. Smart enough to know that wars aren't won by sergeants who ask too many questions." He stepped closer, close enough that Hooper could smell tobacco and coffee on his breath. "3rd Army is moving faster than supply lines can support. We're making field adjustments, temporary holds, strategic redistributions. It's complicated work, and it requires flexibility." His eyes never blinked. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "I understand you're stockpiling fuel that should be at the front, sir." The words hung in the cold air between them. Morrison and Katz were out of the jeep now, rifles held low but ready. Greer had backed away toward his trucks, hands raised slightly, trying to signal that he wanted no part of whatever was about to happen. Voss didn't move. He just stood there, rain dripping from his helmet, staring at Hooper with the kind of cold calculation that came from men who'd learned to operate in the gray spaces between orders and consequences. "You're going to get back in that jeep," Voss said quietly. "And you're going to forget you saw these trucks." "No, sir, I'm not." Voss's jaw tightened. For a moment, Hooper thought the major might actually draw his sidearm, a Colt 1911 holstered at his hip, probably never fired in anger. But Voss was smarter than that. Violence left evidence. Instead, he stepped back and smiled, though it looked more like a warning than anything friendly. "Then I'll file a report. Insubordination, interference with logistics operations. You'll be digging latrines in some rear echelon unit by the end of the week." He turned toward his jeep. "Greer, get these trucks moving. Route Charlie like we discussed." Hooper watched Voss drive away, his jeep disappearing into the rain-shrouded road. Greer stood beside his trucks looking miserable and young. "Sergeant, I'm sorry. He said it was authorized. He said—" His voice trailed off. Hooper didn't blame him. Lieutenants followed orders. That's how the Army worked. But someone higher up was giving those orders, and that someone was turning fuel depots into chess pieces, while infantry divisions stalled for lack of gasoline. Hooper climbed back into his jeep. Morrison started the engine. They followed Greer's convoy, staying 50 yards back, watching. Route Charlie led northeast, away from the main supply corridors, toward a sector marked on maps as rear consolidation area. It should have been empty, just farmland and bombed villages waiting for civil affairs teams. But when they crested a low hill 20 minutes later, Hooper saw something that made him signal Morrison to stop. Below, hidden in a shallow valley, was a fuel dump 3 times the size of the official depot. Hundreds of drums stacked under camouflage nets, tanker trucks parked in rows, a command tent with radio antennas, and guards, at least a dozen men with rifles, patrolling the perimeter like this was forward operating territory. Morrison whistled low. Jesus Christ. Katz raised binoculars, scanning the compound. That's not 3rd Army markings, Sarge. Those drums are coded for 9th Army. And those trucks, he adjusted focus. Those are British Bedfords. What the hell is British fuel doing 50 miles from our lines? Hooper didn't answer. He was watching Greer's convoy roll through the gate below, watching men swarm the trucks to offload drums with the efficiency of a unit that had done this many times before. This wasn't improvisation. This was organized, systematic. Someone was diverting fuel from multiple armies and stockpiling it here for reasons that had nothing to do with winning the war faster. They pulled back before the guards spotted them. Hooper drove in silence, his mind working through possibilities, discarding the unlikely ones, focusing on what fit. Fuel was leverage. Fuel was power. An officer who controlled supply lines controlled movement, and movement decided battles. If someone wanted to delay Patton's advance, or profit from it, this was how you'd do it. Create artificial scarcity, force commanders to negotiate, sell fuel back at inflated prices to desperate units. It had happened in Italy. Rumors said it happened in North Africa too, but never at this scale, never this organized. Back at the depot, Captain Ferris listened without interrupting. When Hooper finished, Ferris sat back in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands. You're describing a black market fuel ring operating inside Allied logistics, he said quietly. Do you understand what that means? If you're wrong, we're both finished. Court-martialed. If you're right. He stopped. They both knew what happened to whistleblowers in the army, even the righteous ones. Ferris pulled out a bottle of bourbon from his footlocker and poured 2 fingers into the coffee cup. He didn't offer any to Hooper. Who else knows? Morrison, Katz, Greer, but he won't talk, he's too scared. And this Major Voss? He knows I know. He's already planning how to bury me. Hooper leaned forward. Captain, we have 48 hours, maybe less, before he files that insubordination report. After that, no one will listen to us. They'll transfer us out, separate us, and this whole thing disappears. His voice stayed calm, but there was steel underneath. We need to document everything. Convoy logs, route changes, missing tonnage. Build a case before Voss shuts us down. Ferris drank the bourbon in one swallow. And who do we take it to? Voss reports to Colonel Marsh. Marsh controls 3rd Army logistics. For all we know, he's part of it. He set the cup down hard. We're 2 supply officers trying to accuse senior command of running a black market operation during wartime. They'll call us paranoid. They'll call us traitors. But even as he said it, Ferris was already reaching for the files, already pulling convoy records from the cabinet, because he was a soldier, and soldiers didn't ignore evidence just because it was dangerous. You know, sometimes I think about the men who fought battles that never made it into history books. Not the ones with medals and memorials, but the ones who stood in muddy depots and asked hard questions when it would have been easier to look away. Those men saved lives too, even if no one ever knew their names. If this story means something to you, if you remember someone who served quietly, who did what was right when no one was watching, share this video. These stories matter. They always have. They worked through the night. Morrison and Katz stood guard outside while Hooper and Ferris compiled evidence by the light of a kerosene lamp. Convoy manifests, fuel requisitions, radio logs showing route changes that didn't match official orders. By dawn, they had 23 documented instances of diverted fuel, over 200,000 gallons that should have reached frontline units but hadn't. It was enough to keep an armored division running for a week, enough to change the outcome of a battle. And somewhere, someone was sitting on it waiting. For what? A higher price, a better deal, or something worse? The answer came at 0600 when a staff car pulled up to the depot. Not Voss this time, the colonel from yesterday. the one who'd called Hooper a coward. He stepped out with 2 MPs and walked straight to the command tent without knocking. Ferris stood up. Hooper stayed seated, one hand resting on the folder of evidence. The colonel looked at them both with the kind of cold authority that ends conversations before they start. "Captain Ferris, you're relieved of command, pending investigation into supply irregularities." His eyes shifted to Hooper. "Sergeant Hooper, you're under arrest." "On what charge, sir?" "Theft of military property, falsification of documents, conspiracy to defraud the United States government." The colonel's voice was flat, rehearsed. "Major Voss filed a report last night. Said you've been running fuel to the black market. Said he has witnesses." He nodded to the MPs. They moved forward with handcuffs. Morrison appeared in the tent entrance, rifle half raised, looking at Hooper for guidance. Katz was right behind him, face hard. The colonel's hand dropped to his sidearm. "Tell your men to stand down, Sergeant. This doesn't have to get ugly." Hooper looked at the folder on the table. 23 convoys, 200,000 gallons. Evidence that could bring down Voss and everyone protecting him, if it ever reached someone who cared. But right now, in this tent, it was just paper, and paper burned. He met the colonel's eyes and saw something there that made his stomach tighten. Not anger, not righteousness, just calculation. This colonel wasn't investigating anything. He was cleaning up, making the problem disappear. Hooper stood slowly, hands visible, non-threatening. "Morrison, Katz, stand down. That's an order." The MPs cuffed him. Not tight, but firm enough to make the point. As they let him out, Hooper looked back at Ferris, who stood beside the table with the folder still in reach. Their eyes met. Ferris gave the smallest nod, the kind of gesture you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. The kind that said, "I've got this, don't worry." But Hooper did worry, because he'd seen this play out before, in other wars, other units. Good men arrested, evidence disappearing, truth buried under official reports that told a cleaner story. They put him in the staff car, MPs on either side. The colonel climbed into the front passenger seat and lit a cigarette, blowing smoke against the windshield. "You should have taken the transfer when Voss offered it," he said without turning around. "Could have ended your career quietly. Now it ends loud. Court-martial loud. Leavenworth loud." He flicked ash onto the floor. "You have a family, Sergeant?" Hooper didn't answer. The colonel smiled at his reflection in the glass. "Thought so. Always the stubborn ones with something to lose. Hope it was worth it." The car rolled through the depot gates. Hooper watched the fuel stacks pass by. Jerry cans and drums and tanker trucks that should have been moving east, toward Germany. Toward the war that men were dying in right now because they ran out of gas 50 miles from victory. He thought about Patton's tanks stalled on frozen roads. Thought about infantry pinned down without armored support. Thought about the careful geometry of Voss's operation, diverting just enough fuel to slow the advance without stopping it completely, creating demand that could be sold back at premium to desperate commanders who'd pay anything to keep moving. It was brilliant in a sick way, and it was working. They drove for 30 minutes, the road winding through ruined countryside. The colonel finished his cigarette and immediately lit another. The MPs said nothing. Hooper's wrists ached from the cuffs, but he kept his face neutral, his breathing steady. He was thinking about timing, about where Ferris would take the evidence, about whether Morrison and Katz would follow orders or do something stupid and brave, about the fact that Voss had moved faster than expected, which meant Hooper had been right about something. This operation was bigger than one major skimming fuel for profit. The staff car slowed. Ahead, at a crossroads marked by a shot-up German half-track, another vehicle sat waiting. A Jeep. Major Voss stood beside it, hands in his pockets, watching the staff car approach with the patience of a man who'd already won. The colonel ordered the driver to stop. He got out, spoke to Voss in low tones Hooper couldn't hear. Then Voss walked to the staff car and leaned down to look through the window at Hooper, his face expressionless. "Last chance, Sergeant. Tell me where Captain Ferris hid the files, and this ends here. No trial, no Leavenworth, just a quiet discharge and a bus ticket home." "I don't know what files you're talking about, sir." Voss smiled. "Wrong answer." He straightened up and nodded to the colonel. They spoke again, longer this time, more animated. The colonel's expression changed from confidence to something that looked almost like doubt. He glanced back at Hooper, then at Voss, then shook his head slowly. Voss's face darkened. Whatever they were arguing about, the colonel was pushing back. Finally, Voss pulled a folded paper from his jacket and showed it to the colonel, who read it and went very still. When he looked at Hooper again, his face had changed completely. The authority drained away, replaced by something close to fear. He walked back to the staff car and opened the door. "Uncuff him," he told the MPs. They hesitated, confused. "Now. Do it now." His voice cracked slightly. The MPs unlocked the handcuffs. Hooper rubbed his wrists, watching the colonel, watching Voss, trying to understand what had just shifted in the last 30 seconds. The colonel stepped back, almost stumbling, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Sir, I didn't know. Major Voss didn't tell me. If I'd known who you were." He stopped, swallowed hard. "I apologize. This was a mistake. A terrible mistake." Hooper climbed out of the car. Voss stood 10 feet away, the folded paper still in his hand, his face pale. The rain had stopped, leaving everything wet and gray and cold. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled. Hooper looked at the paper in Voss's hand. Just a single sheet. Nothing dramatic, but it had turned a colonel into an apologetic mess and drained all the confidence from a major who'd been smiling 2 minutes ago. Hooper didn't reach for it. He just stood there, waiting, knowing that whatever happened next would depend on the truth written on that paper. A truth that Voss had just discovered, and now wished he hadn't. Hooper held out his hand. Voss gave him the paper without a word, his fingers trembling slightly. The colonel stood beside the staff car like a man waiting for execution. The MPs looked at each other, confused. Their training telling them to follow orders, but their instincts screaming that something fundamental had just shifted in the power dynamic. Hooper unfolded the document slowly. It was his service record, not the one filed at the depot, but the real one. The one that showed he wasn't just a sergeant. He was a lieutenant colonel in the Inspector General's office, operating under special orders from SHAEF headquarters. 3 months undercover. 3 months watching fuel disappear while good men died. "Lieutenant Colonel William Hooper," Voss said quietly, his voice hollow. "Special investigator, direct authority from Eisenhower's staff." He looked at the ground, jaw working. "You've been here the whole time watching us, building a case." His hands clenched into fists at his sides, then relaxed. There was nothing left to fight with. No more threats, no more leverage. Just the cold realization that he'd arrested the one man who could end him with a signature. The colonel from 3rd Army stepped forward, his face ashen. "Sir, I swear I didn't know. Voss told me you were running a black market operation. I was following orders." Hooper folded the paper and put it in his jacket. "You were following the wrong orders." His voice carried no anger, no satisfaction. Just the flat certainty of a man who'd spent 3 months pretending to be someone he wasn't, so he could catch people like Voss in the act. "You arrested an investigating officer on fabricated charges. You threatened witnesses. You conspired to destroy evidence." He looked at Voss. "And you built a fuel theft ring that's cost the 3rd Army 2 weeks of offensive momentum. How many men died in those 2 weeks, Major? How many tanks got hit because they couldn't maneuver? How many infantry units got overrun because armor support never showed up?" Voss didn't answer. His face had gone from pale to gray, the color of wet concrete. He stared at Hooper like he was looking at a ghost. The ghost of his career, his freedom, maybe his life. Courts-martial for wartime profiteering could end with a firing squad. Everyone knew that. The Army didn't forgive officers who stole from soldiers, especially not during a war. The colonel cleared his throat, desperate. "Sir, if I can explain—" But Hooper raised one hand and the colonel went silent, because that's what colonels did when lieutenant colonels told them to shut up, even disgraced ones, even ones who'd just realized they'd bet everything on the wrong side. "How many others?" Hooper asked. His eyes stayed on Voss. "How many officers are part of this?" Voss's mouth opened, closed. He looked at the colonel, who looked away. The silence stretched out, broken only by wind through bare trees and the distant sound of trucks on the main road. Supply convoys moving fuel that would actually reach the front this time, because Hooper had been there, watching, documenting, waiting for enough evidence to justify what came next. Finally, Voss spoke, his voice barely audible. 17, across 4 armies. Supply officers, transport commanders, depot managers. He swallowed hard. It started small, skimming a few drums here and there. Then someone realized we could do more, control the flow, create shortages, sell back at premium. Who organized it? Colonel Marsh, 3rd Army Logistics Chief. Boss's shoulders sagged. He recruited me 6 months ago, said it was low risk, said everyone did it in Italy. Said by the time anyone noticed, the war would be over and we'd be stateside with enough money to retire comfortable. His laugh was bitter and short. I believed him. I actually believed him. He looked up at Hooper, something like desperation in his eyes. We didn't think we were hurting anyone. We told ourselves that it was just inefficiency, just the army being wasteful like always. We didn't think about the men in the tanks. Hooper studied him for a long moment. Part of him wanted to feel satisfaction. 3 months of playing dumb, of saluting men he outranked, of biting his tongue while officers like Voss stole from soldiers who trusted them. But all he felt was tired and angry in a way that went deeper than words. You know what I think, Major? I think you knew exactly what you were doing. You just didn't care. He turned to the colonel. You're both under arrest. So is Colonel Marsh, and every officer on Voss's list. His voice was cold now, surgical. The MPs will take you back to headquarters. You'll be held pending court-martial. If you're smart, you'll cooperate fully. The colonel started to protest, then thought better of it. The MPs moved forward, uncertain but obedient, and put Voss in handcuffs. The major didn't resist. He just stood there, wrists together, staring at nothing while the steel clicked shut around them. They loaded him into the staff car. The colonel climbed in after, moving like a man in a dream. One of the MPs looked at Hooper, waiting for orders. Take them to Scaife Provost Marshal. Tell Major Brennan I'm invoking emergency authority under Directive 47. He'll know what that means. The MP saluted. A real salute this time, not the casual gesture enlisted men gave sergeants. Yes, sir. The staff car drove away. Hooper stood alone at the crossroads, watching it disappear into the gray morning. His hands were shaking. Not from fear or cold, but from the adrenaline crash that came after 3 months of constant tension finally broke. He'd played his role perfectly. Never slipped. Never gave Voss or Marsh or any of them a reason to suspect he was anything other than a careful sergeant who asked annoying questions. And now it was done. The evidence was documented. The arrests were made. In 48 hours, Scaife investigators would sweep through every fuel depot from Normandy to the German border, and the whole rotten network would come down. But Hooper wasn't thinking about victory. He was thinking about the tank crews who'd run out of fuel at Metz, the infantry company that got pinned down outside Aachen because armor support stalled 20 miles back, the rifleman who took a bullet because his unit couldn't advance fast enough to flank the machine gun nest. Those men were dead because officers like Voss decided gasoline was more valuable as currency than as fuel. No court-martial would bring them back. No investigation would explain to their families why they died 50 miles from victory in a war that should have ended weeks earlier. He walked back to his Jeep. Voss's Jeep now technically seized evidence, and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. His reflection stared back from the rearview mirror. 3 months of stubble, eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights, uniform mud-stained and worn. He looked like a sergeant. He'd become a sergeant in every way that mattered, living in their world, eating their food, sharing their frustrations. And now he had to go back to being a lieutenant colonel, writing reports and testifying at tribunals, and explaining to generals how 17 of their officers had stolen enough fuel to run an armored division for a month. The sound of an approaching vehicle made him look up. A Jeep came over the hill. Morrison driving, Katz riding shotgun, Captain Ferris in the back seat holding the folder of evidence against his chest like it was made of gold. They skidded to a stop beside him, all 3 men climbing out in a rush. Morrison was grinning. "Sarge, you're not going to believe what happened. After you left, the captain—" He stopped, seeing Hooper's expression. "Sir, are you okay?" The word sir hung in the air, strange and formal. Morrison had never called him that before. Neither had Katz. But somehow they knew. Maybe it was the way Hooper sat, or the absence of handcuffs, or the fact that Voss was gone and the colonel with him. Ferris stepped forward, studying Hooper's face. "How long?" he asked quietly. 3 months since September. I suspected. the way you documented everything, the questions you asked. Ferris smiled, tired but genuine. You're a hell of an investigator, Colonel, and a decent sergeant, too. He handed over the folder. Every convoy, every missing gallon, dates, routes, personnel, it's all there. Enough to prosecute them 10 times over. His voice softened. We got them. Because of you, we got them. Morrison and Katz stood silent, processing the revelation, recalibrating everything they'd known about the quiet sergeant who'd taught them how to track convoys and read fuel manifests and care about numbers that most soldiers ignored. Hooper took the folder. 23 documented thefts, 200,000 gallons, 17 corrupt officers. It should have felt like winning. Instead, it felt like accounting, adding up a cost that had already been paid in blood. He looked at the 3 men standing before him, good soldiers who'd trusted a sergeant enough to follow him into danger, and realized that trust was worth more than any rank insignia. Thank you, he said simply. All of you. I couldn't have done this without you. Morrison shrugged, embarrassed. Katz nodded once, his Brooklyn tough exterior cracking just enough to show respect. Ferris saluted, and this time Hooper returned it, the gesture carrying weight it hadn't before. They drove back to the depot together, 4 men in 2 jeeps, the morning sun breaking through clouds for the first time in days. The roads were still muddy, still torn by war, but fuel convoys were rolling again. Real ones this time, heading east toward the front, where Patton's tanks were waiting. Hooper watched them pass, trucks loaded with drums that would reach their destination, drivers who wouldn't be ordered off route by officers playing black market games. It wasn't redemption. The dead stayed dead, but it was something. A small correction in a war full of mistakes. A moment when the right thing happened because someone had stood in a muddy depot and refused to look away. At headquarters, Schaeff investigators were already arriving, grim-faced captains with briefcases and legal pads, ready to tear apart Voss's organization piece by piece. Hooper met with them briefly, handed over the evidence, gave his initial statement. They'd want more later. Depositions, testimony, a full operational report. But for now, they had enough to start. Enough to arrest the remaining officers on Voss's list. Enough to shut down the hidden fuel dumps and redirect supplies back to legitimate channels. The head investigator, a major with wire-rimmed glasses and a prosecutor's intensity, shook Hooper's hand. Good work, Colonel. Clean operation. No leaks. He glanced at the folder. This might be the biggest corruption case we've prosecuted since Anzio. The general will want to commend you personally. Hooper didn't care about commendations. He changed out of his muddy uniform, packed his gear, and prepared to leave the depot he'd called home for 3 months. Morrison and Katz helped him load his duffel into a jeep, neither one saying much. There wasn't much to say. They'd been part of something important, something that mattered, and now it was over. Ferris walked him to the gate, hands in his pockets, looking older than he had that morning. Where will they send you next? He asked. Hooper shrugged. Wherever Schaff needs an investigator. There's always another black market. Another officer who thinks he's smarter than the system. He paused. What about you? Think they'll let you keep the depot? Probably. Someone has to make sure the fuel actually reaches the front. Ferris smiled. At least now I know I can trust my sergeants. They shook hands. No salutes this time, just 2 soldiers acknowledging what they'd shared. Hooper climbed into the jeep. The driver, a corporal he didn't know, started the engine. As they pulled away, Hooper looked back one last time at the depot, at the fuel drums stacked under dripping camouflage nets, at Morrison and Katz standing beside Ferris, watching him go. He'd been someone else here for 3 months. A sergeant who cared about numbers, a man who asked questions. It had been the most important role he'd ever played, and the hardest to leave behind. The jeep rolled through the Norman countryside, past ruined villages and frozen fields, toward a headquarters where he'd write reports and brief generals and become a lieutenant colonel again. But part of him would always be Sergeant Hooper, standing in the rain with a fuel manifest in his hand, staring down a major who thought rank was enough to make truth disappear. That sergeant had been real, maybe more real than the colonel. And in the end, that sergeant had done what good sergeants always did, protected his men, even when those men were tank crews and infantry companies he'd never meet. Soldiers who'd never know that a quiet man in a supply depot had fought his own kind of war so they could fight theirs. The war would end eventually. Germany would fall. Men would go home. And somewhere in the official records, buried in classified files that wouldn't be opened for 50 years, there'd be a report about Lieutenant Colonel William Hooper and a fuel theft operation that cost the Third Army 2 weeks of momentum. But the soldiers who benefited from his work would never read that report. They'd just know that one day the fuel started arriving on time, and tanks that had been stalled for lack of gasoline suddenly had enough to push toward Berlin. That was enough. It had to be enough, because in war you didn't always get to see the faces you saved. Sometimes you just had to trust that saving them mattered. You know, I've thought about this story for a long time, about the men who fought in the shadows, who wore the wrong uniform so they could make the right thing happen. Bill Hooper went home after the war. Quiet discharge. No medals. No headlines. Just a man who'd done his job and knew what it cost. If someone you loved served in the war, if they came home and never talked about what they did because it didn't involve firefights or beach landings, maybe they were like Hooper. Maybe they fought battles no one saw, and won victories no one remembered. Those stories matter. They've always mattered, and if you're still here listening to this old tale about fuel and corruption and a sergeant who wasn't what he seemed, thank you. Hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment. Tell us about someone you knew who served quietly, because these men, these quiet warriors, they deserve to be remembered too.